Thank you so much to Food and Water Watch for having me. Congrats on this gathering, and I'm thrilled to be part of this esteemed lineup. I'm Ari Berman, as they said in the intro, senior reporter for Mother Jones, author of the book, Give Us the Ballot. And we are really at a critical moment for democracy. And I want to talk to you guys about voting rights, which really is a topic that hits everything else. Whether we have the right to vote determines so many things in our democracy and in our country, whether we have access to clean food and clean water, whether we have access to a thriving economy, whether we have access to a country and a planet in which all people are treated equally. All of that depends on whether we have the right to vote and the right to free elections. And we have seen that right undermined really in unprecedented ways in the last year. I've been covering voting rights for a decade now. And the attack on voting rights right now is so far beyond what I've ever covered and what people who study this topic have seen in the past. And at first glance, things went really well in 2020. We had the highest turnout in 120 years, the highest turnout since 1900, which was remarkable given how many people couldn't even vote back in 1900. So we had the highest turnout in such a long time. That really should have become the new normal. The hope was that this high turnout would become the norm in future elections. Instead, we had an unprecedented attempt to try to overturn and steal the election, followed by an insurrection at the Capitol, followed by all of these new laws to make it harder to vote. 21 states have passed 52 new laws in 2021 to make it harder to vote. And basically, the goal of this is to try to achieve the goals of the insurrection through other means. That because they failed at stealing the last election, they want to rig the rules to be able to essentially steal future elections. And this is a really scary moment for democracy. If you look at these bills that have passed, places like Florida, Georgia, Texas, there isn't one provision or two provisions making it harder to vote. There's 16, 17, 20 provisions making it harder to vote. They're making it harder to vote by mail in all sorts of different ways, by preventing people from sending out mail ballot request forms or cutting the number of drop boxes or preventing people from automatically getting ballots. They're also cutting back on the amount of time that people have to vote, cutting early voting, making it easier to remove people from the voting rolls, giving partisan poll watchers free movement inside the polls to disrupt the process and intimidate voters. And even in some states, making it easier to overturn elections, to contest elections in the future, which is exactly what Trump wanted and failed to get in 2020. And one of the things we've learned is that these voter suppression efforts are funded and organized by the biggest dark money groups in the country. We broke a story in Mother Jones a few months ago showing that the Heritage Foundation and its sister group, Heritage Action for America, took credit for writing all of these bills. They said that they wrote what they called model legislation in places like Georgia and Texas and Arizona and so many other key states. And they said, we did it quietly and we did it quickly. Nobody even noticed. And we know that these organizations, although they are dark money, are funded by interests like the Koch brothers. So the same kind of people that are funding attacks on clean water, on clean food, on clean air, are the same interests, the same corporate interests that are now funding voter suppression efforts. And that's why so many states have passed such similar pieces of legislation in such a short period of time. And you have to go back before there was a Voting Rights Act. You have to go back to the Jim Crow era to find so many states suppressing voting rights in such a short period of time. And it's not like one is the exact same as the other. The literacy tests and the poll taxes that were passed in the 1900s, late 1800s. Obviously, they're not as bad as the kind of things that are passed now, but it's moved from let's suppress all Black voters, let's suppress all Latino voters, to let's suppress just enough voters of color, just enough young voters, just enough lower income voters so that we can win future elections. And if the majority doesn't support us, let's create our own majority. Now, the good news is that there is legislation in Congress that could stop this. There is a new bill called the Freedom to Vote Act that contains many of the core provisions in the For the People Act, which has already passed the House, but has been blocked by a Republican filibuster in the Senate. The Freedom to Vote Act would enact policies like automatic registration, election day registration, 2 weeks of early voting, restoring voting rights to people with past felony convictions, making election day a federal holiday, banning partisan gerrymandering, which is so important because so many states are enacting new redistricting maps that are going to be heavily gerrymandered. And I wrote an article not too long ago finding that in 4 states alone, in Florida, Georgia, Texas, and North Carolina, Republicans could gerrymander enough seats to take back the House just from gerrymandering in these 4 states alone. So a ban on partisan gerrymandering is incredibly important because that's as big of a threat as voter suppression. And another example of politicians choosing their own voters as opposed to voters choosing the politicians. And then it also includes legislation and provisions that would crack down on the dark money groups that I mentioned earlier are funding voter suppression efforts. The main impediment to passing this bill is the filibuster, because it has the support of all 50 Democratic senators. If this were a state, if Congress were a state, it would have already passed, because if you look at how voter suppression laws pass in the states, they passed on simple majority party line votes. So there's been an asymmetry of tactics. In the states, Republicans are using their majorities to make it harder to vote through simple majority party line votes. But in Washington, Senate Democrats are unwilling to use their power to protect the right to vote through simple majority party line votes. And we would all like things to be bipartisan. But the fact is, we're in a situation where if one party is deliberately making it harder to vote, the other party has the responsibility to protect voting rights. And we're in a situation where if Democrats who are in power right now in Washington don't use their power to protect voting rights, then nobody else will. And it's really important to note that the filibuster isn't just an impediment to protecting voting rights. It's an impediment to protecting our environment. It's an impediment to economic and racial justice. It's an impediment to treating everyone fairly and protecting a woman's right to choose. So many issues are being blocked right now by the filibuster. And we're in a situation where 41 Republican senators, representing just 21% of the country, can block legislation supported by 70, 80, 90% of America. And that's just incredibly undemocratic and shows how our political system doesn't represent the will of the people or the will of the voters. The good news is that a lot more attention is being paid to what's happening to our democracy. A lot more attention is being paid to what's happening to voting rights. I would urge people to focus on this federal legislation. I would also urge you to protect voting rights in your own backyard. Obviously, if you live in a state that's threatened by voter suppression, try to fight back against that. But also if you live in a state that is expanding voting rights, because a lot of states, blue states in particular, are moving in another direction to expand voting rights, like California, like Oregon, like New York, where I live. That's incredibly important because it sets up a different kind of model, a model to protect voting rights, to expand voting rights that can be exported throughout the country. So we're really at a critical hinge moment where the question is, are we going to have democracy work in some places but not others? Are we going to have a democracy in which one party only respects the rules if they win an election, which isn't really a democracy at all? Are we going to have a democracy in which we have the highest turnout in 120 years, or a democracy in which voter suppression becomes the new normal? So those are the stakes right now for democracy. And I thank all of you for listening to me, and I wish all of you a great conference.